If you asked random film fans on the street to name film movements, I would assume the most popular answers would be French New Wave, Italian Neorealism, and I wonder if there'd be that many beyond that. Maybe some would be familiar with mumblecore as a movement, or perhaps Russian montage, given its place in history. But I can't imagine that, there's a high percentage of people that could go, five, seven movements deep, which is not a bad thing. I mean, there's just more movies to watch and more types of movies to watch than anyone could get through in their lifetime. But at the same time, being familiar with movements and understanding, certain evolutions in cinema, be it, changing the grammar or changing the way the film landscape looks for a certain country, is, I think, fascinating and great to help you get familiar with film history as a whole. A couple years ago, I don't remember when because Letterboxd doesn't tell you when it created a list, I put together a list of, right now it's 68 films related to a number of movements that I don't have written down, but we'll say it's like 20 or 30. Not all of these are huge, not all of these are globally impactful, but by looking through a number of these movements, you can get a feel for where certain techniques came from, what cinema looked like before and after some of those changes, as well as getting a look into the film culture of certain areas of the world. And that, in addition to the film culture, actually gives you an insight into the, the societal culture and things like that of certain areas. And I think that's worth celebrating and worth highlighting. So I'm going to take this series to go through probably a couple decades by a couple decades, some film movements that I have looked at some and enjoyed. Not all of these are going to have the same level of detail. Some of these I've only seen a couple from and not gotten a ton out of, but some of them I think deserve a good amount of shine. So we're going to start off the earliest film movement that I've watched. I'm sure there's something recognized as earlier, but it kind of seems like generally this is the first defining movement as recognized, at least on a lot of the stuff I've read, and that is German Expressionism. German Expressionist filmmakers used visual distortion and hyper-excessive performance to show inner turmoils, fears, and desires of the area. Some notable directors include F.W. Murnau and Fritz Lang, and some famous works include The Golem, How He Came Into the World, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, and Nosferatu. The style is the most striking and, of course, the main draw of this movement. Cabinet of Dr. Caligari is probably the most common recommendation, although Nosferatu is probably not too far behind. But I haven't seen Nosferatu. I'll just stick with Cabinet. The aesthetic is just written all over the sets, really. Basically, every set piece in the film has some kind of, otherworldly, sinister, angled quality to it. It's like it's set in an alternate universe, or something like that, where everything is just a little bit wrong and jagged and unfriendly. And, given that the, definition provided talks about like the visual distortion, the way that the designs showcase inner turmoils and fears, I think that's you can see with the visual distinctions between something that's just set, like even the film starts out set regularly just in like a courtyard, people sitting around, and you see the emotional difference between that regular type of setting and the crooked lines and the unfriendly angles present basically throughout the main body of the story. And I think personally that's like the perfect distinction and the perfect way to illustrate the impact of art direction, essentially, and the way sets can transform the tone a story takes on. And then there's also something like the makeup of the monster in question, providing a sort of otherworldly quality to the monster himself, matching the surroundings. French Impressionism. I didn't say this, but German Expressionism is like early 20s through the 20s, essentially. French Impressionism, somewhat disputed as a movement, because it wasn't as unified of a vision. But nonetheless, it emphasized emotional representation as opposed to objective reality, and it played a part in developing film theory. Some notable directors include Abel Gance and Louis Deluc. Some notable works include Fiève and Napoléon. So the one I'm actually going to use to highlight this movement is The Smiling Madame Beudet by Germaine Dulac. And there's, I think, not that many female directors that are going to come up through the course of this series, so I'll take the opportunity here because I love this movie. And I think it's happens to be a great example of the movement already. So even more reason to highlight it. So I think you can see from this film the way that it presents non-literal things, or the way it visually represents the inner workings of the wife in the film. It depicts dream sequences, it depicts inner thoughts, as, like she's responding to this man in her head, the way she's, small in comparison to this voice yelling at her. Earlier, it shows, kind of her envisioning this choir playing. Later on, it uses these double exposures to kind of communicate that the specter of her husband is always present, even when he is not there physically. There's great usage of slow motion, actually. Honestly, maybe the best slow motion sequence, or top few that I've seen, in this kind of terrifying scene of her husband kind of entering through a window. And, it's all these things that characterize the movement, really. It's kind of expanding what film could show. It's expanding the places that the camera can represent. I love the way this movie portrays these inner thoughts, and I think this is something well worth spending time on. Next, Surrealism. Something else that originated perhaps in France. Surrealism, of course, is still with us today. There are certainly surrealist films that have been made throughout the decades, still being made. But originating here, mid-20s. Surrealism relies on the juxtaposition of symbols, images, or actions to create a world outside of reality. And some notable early filmmakers included Man Ray and Louis Buñuel. Some notable works include The Starfish, Entr'acte, and The Seashell and the Clergyman. Also, Germain Bullock, The Seashell and the Clergyman. So actually, second appearance on this list. But I'm not really thinking of discussing a specific film. If you need a feel for surrealism, honestly, you should just watch one. Any of the three recommended ones would work fine. They're all short. It kind of, honestly, it feels like a little bit counter to the movement to try to explain why it works in a certain sense. You'll hear people say that, surrealist stuff should be felt, not explained, or the logic shouldn't be applied to it. And while I kind of disagree with that, I think you can always analyze things even if they're non-literal. I do think the best sense you can get of it is to just experience it and see the emotional connections that you draw between seemingly unrelated things. I think it would be hard to explain the effect without feeling it first. So, go watch some of these. They're really wonderful. They're really fascinating to try to piece together. Fascinating to try to, honestly, because in a sense you have to construct the story for yourself in some of them. Some of them the story is more direct, but there is a lot of work to be done often if you want to have, an internal sense of closure, at least, even if there's no objective sense of closure for what happened in the story. Soviet montage, one of my favorite movements. Soviet montage is a film editing technique that focuses on creating meaningful associations between shots rather than making cuts invisible. Some notable filmmakers, Sergei Eisenstein and Lev Kuleshov. Some recommended works include Battleship Potemkin, Strike, Arsenal, October, also known as 10 Days That Shook the World, and By the Law. Recommending more, of course, in this case, because I love these movies. By the Law has not, well, at least on Letterboxd, doesn't have a ton of views. I don't know how many people have seen it, but I think it's really great. And I'm going to use it as some examples here. This one is going to be tougher to show quick examples of because it's in the editing, it's in the sequence of images rather than an image that depicts the style. Again, just watch these. A number of them are available on YouTube anyway. One of the best examples for me is in By the Law. There is a conflict that takes place in a cabin between, a few people. As the conflict escalates and climaxes, the film will cut periodically to this shot of the kettle boiling and the fire burning underneath it. And, the series, I think it comes back to it 2 or 3 times. And each time the fire under the kettle is burning more, the kettle is steaming more, as the conflict is kind of burning and simmering itself. So it has these elements of a literal event happening and an emotional event happening. And it utilizes this connection between the two where we can see the literal effect of the fight happening and the literal emotional conflict being depicted on screen. And we also have the emotional representation of pressure building up, of heat building up, of kind of the boiling of the water increasing in intensity. And we can intuit this connection between them, that these two types of events are one and the same. October additionally has kind of a famous cut of a, going to, I believe it was like a gilded peacock at kind of an auspicious time. Which, I mean, like, it is a serious movie. I know I'm kind of laughing because, if I say that out of context, right, like, that doesn't make any sense. I think that one's a little more fun because it's more vague and kind of, well, at least for me, it took me like a second to figure out. But it's I think that's like the general component of it. It's a literal image and something that you have to connect to internally. And I mean, I love stuff that makes you do a little bit of work to figure it out, so it's right up my alley. I think it's a fascinating way to construct a story and to draw connections to things. Like the definition said, this is not about making cuts invisible. This is not about necessarily the smoothest experience possible. This is about utilizing a part of film that was supposed to be invisible and bringing it to the forefront, giving it a role in the artistic process that didn't exist before. And I mean, I love the idea of, cuts drawing associations to things already, be it invisible or as, blatant as some of these. It's also worth noting that not every single, instance of Soviet montage has these kind of mind-boggling associations drawn. Sometimes they're much more natural, you might say. Sometimes they're less visible than others. But I think these are a couple of easy connections to draw between, like, oh, this is clearly the style at work. This is clearly something we have to draw an emotional association to. So those were some main movements of the 20s. I will, I guess, make another one covering maybe 30s and 40s. I don't know how long that'll take. We'll dice it up. We'll do a few more videos and we'll get through, I guess, all the movements on the list, or most of them at least. So, see you in the next one.